Since this is going to be a review that primarily brings up critiques, I hope it can be interesting and showing a diverse opinion given how highly rated Severance Season 2 is. And I'm not doing this out of hate for the show because I genuinely love Season 1. I still think there are great positives, and I'll lay out generally what I like briefly before diving into my criticisms. I think it's indisputable how well made Severance is from a production standpoint. The cinematography is surprisingly groundbreaking for a show that has such a limiting environment. Most shots elevate the storytelling with their sheer creativity and presentation, and some shots evoke a deeper layer of thought, like Milchek literally crossing a line to scold and establish dominance over Mark. The general set design and lighting juxtapose between different environments and create this ironic feeling that the outside world is grim and dark, while Lumen is clean and safe, adding to this surreal feeling. Another outstanding aspect is the acting. Everyone essentially delivers a masterful performance, and I especially love the trust Ben Stiller has in letting scenes breathe, highlighting the raw talent of the cast. The editing for certain sequences like Reintegration and Episode 7 are stellar. I love the unconventional lighting for dialogue scenes, and the general surreality of Severance's world is captivating. Now, I can definitely talk about all of this in depth and go into other points of production, but I'm assuming the writing and story are the main points you want to see, as this is the point where I'm deviating and think the writing is flawed. But I wanted to first pay my respects to Severance. One of my main critiques is that the plot drags its feet significantly throughout Season 2. It feels like the writers had this main plot point they wanted to end on, but didn't know how to meaningfully fill 10 episodes worth of story up until that point. You may immediately disagree with this, and I'll go into a few reasons. The first one is that, in retrospect especially, 3 of the first 4 episodes don't actually advance the plot, or the writers are making Milchek put the story into a scenario that is baffling in the sense that it feels like he's wasting time. One obvious example is the first episode where he replaces Mark's team with a new one. Naturally, this would lead to Mark being very upset, and he'd most likely demand to have his team back. And from our perspective when originally viewing this episode, this makes sense. They wanted to replace them because they caused too many problems. However, from what we learn later, Mark is their golden child and they'll do anything to keep him happy and working. So this now operates as a contradiction in motivation in which it's a massive oversight to not expect Mark to be upset here and thus not work. Like, what did they expect by taking away his love interest and friends he grew very close to? This creates this situation where the first episode is just getting the original team back, when that should have been the starting point of the season. And then for episode 2, I think it's really interesting, but I don't know if we needed to see all of the inner machinations of how exactly everyone came back, creating this feeling in which the 3rd episode of the season is the true starting point, and there are some points of development made in those first 2 episodes, but you can easily have those later on. Then this leads us to episode 4. From what I've seen, everyone loves this episode, and I'll go into different reasons throughout the video about why I don't love it. Going back to the point I made about Milchek making a baffling decision in episode 1, I find it pretty crazy that he take these severed workers on a field trip given how many different things can go wrong. This isn't like a hindsight analysis type of deal because my internal red flags were going crazy throughout the episode. Milchek gives them so much freedom, and for how rebellious they are, this can only lead to problems. Especially handing them literal weapons. Like, that was a primary point of conflict in Season 1 where they had to nullify the office. And I know Helly was the main cause for danger and she's currently replaced by Helena, but how can Milchek be certain about the others? With this said, from a motivation perspective, why not give them Defiant Jazz 2.0 as a reward? Mark throughout the season is a softball and seems perfectly content with just working.
We'd like to have a funeral.
Is this MDR's position?
Sure, as long as it's quick.
So I don't think it was at all warranted to go on this massive field trip with significant potential downsides. Maybe this would make more sense if Mark was not motivated to get any work done, so this was Milchek's Hail Mary to get him inspired to finish Cold Harbor. However, that's not the case. This gives me the impression that the writers inherently wanted this episode to be the boiling over point spurred by the circumstances of this environment. I do have other issues with this episode, but I'll go into them when I move on from the plot dragging point. Outside of those first 4 episodes, one last episode that heavily slows everything down is episode 8, Cobell-centric episode. This is okay in the sense that we need this to happen, but structuring it in a way that it takes up an entire episode, I think is poorly done. This should have been a subplot that we cut to occasionally throughout the season, especially since there are maybe 5 minutes of actual plot substance within this episode. Then there's also the fact that Cobell's character has been in limbo for half of the season. She drives off in episode 3, and I guess she's just been driving around for 5 episodes? Even though she's able to drive back to Devin and Mark within less than a day after episode 8. The timeline in that regard is really iffy, and it genuinely doesn't seem like the writers knew what to do with her character before episode 8. I was excited to see Cobell gain her own devious plan to get back at Lumen, and instead, the writers stalled us out by not even including her character because they needed that to happen in the finale. Going back to the story being drawn out, I've mostly brought up examples of episodes not advancing the plot enough, and 2 other points synergize with this problem. One of them is that this season is primarily composed of a bunch of disconnected subplots. Irving on the outside pursuing Bert, Milchek dealing with the execs, Cobell's limbo-y adventure, Dylan romancing Gretchen, and Helena also has some occasional scenes. In comparison to season 1, the season 2 narrative is much more muddled. Everything is so fragmented, and this also inherently slows down the season and distracts away from Mark's primary objective. It's established in the beginning that we need to find this dark hallway, but it doesn't feel like we actually try to achieve that objective until the very end. Another general objective was Mark reintegrating, and when that was happening in episode 3, I was extremely excited. Unfortunately, that essentially fizzles out into being practically inconsequential for season 2, outside of being a negotiating tactic in the finale. And every time we got a scene that advanced the progression here, we'd normally cut away. Like the second Mark starts that process, we go into episode 4, and don't revisit the reintegration until episode 5, which again ends on another cliffhanger. This starts to get frustrating because the seemingly big point of development that's also the most interesting part of the story is being drawn out by the writers creating multiple perspectives that don't serve the main plot. Milchek and Cobell's do, but Irving's and Dylan's subplots unfortunately don't. Like, you can essentially cut out Dylan from season 2 and basically nothing changes besides him shoving a vending machine into the bathroom door in the finale. His perspective was so isolated in season 2 to the point that he's literally put in a closet for the finale and Milchek sprints out the door to go back to the main plot. This isn't to say that I dislike these subplots because they explore interesting concepts. In Innie cheating on his Audi's wife, Irving pursuing the love that his Innie experienced, or even the Innies going on a field trip and getting to experience the outdoors. These are fundamentally cool concepts, but I don't think they particularly synergize with advancing the plot forward. It's essentially the conundrum of, I like the parts, but not the sum of its parts. Season 1 placed an importance on everyone. It was a team effort. However, Season 2 only places that narrative importance on Mark, invalidating the other characters in the process. Along with the explanation from the finale in which Mark is building these memory-esque rooms for Gemma, so it becomes a bit questionable in terms of what his other team members are actually doing. I'm sure you can explain it, and it's unfortunate that Mark essentially receives all the narrative weight for Season 2. Outside of how the subplots and general story structure communicate this feeling of the plot dragging, there are also micro examples of this. And that's the writers overutilizing this trope of a character initially not wanting to do something until being convinced to do it. This isn't a negative trope and generally signifies internal change within a character as they're changing their mind, illustrating personal agency. The negative thing here is that this applies to almost every Mark scene. He doesn't want to talk about Gemma in the beginning and draws that out. Like, they specifically go to this diner to talk about that, and then he leaves and refuses to talk about it. He draws out their reintegration process, which is warranted, and there are multiple other points like him dealing with Cobell towards the end. Since most scenes surrounding Mark use this trope, it artificially draws out most of his development, which is already sparse to begin with. To clarify, this wouldn't be a big deal on its own, but this compounded with all the other points starts to make the overall stunted plot growth worse. Let's pivot away and address an aspect of Season 2 that everyone loved that I want to give an opposing viewpoint on. And that's the twist that Helly was actually Helena in the first 4 episodes. I have 2 main flaws here, and the first one is that I think the creators make this twist too obvious. There are too many puzzle pieces given to us that allude to this being the twist. Those pieces are Helly not acting like herself, why did she lie about what she saw, why is she being awkward around Mark in terms of expressing love, and there's even suspicion from Irving immediately, which generally, if you're addressing that, then it's probably important and isn't a fluke. There are a lot of pieces of information that point to Helly not being herself, and I'd argue that just one of these pieces is plenty of information to point the viewer in the right direction. Just the point of Helly having a major behavioral shift should be enough given that Helly and Helena are opposite characters. One represents rebellion and is extremely lively, and the other is more subdued, secretive, and is a literal executive. From a writing perspective, I can maybe see going against this because it's been 3 years since Season 1, and returning viewers may not be able to pick up on these differences. But fundamentally, from a writing perspective, I think you should always treat your audience as if they're really smart. So even if they do miss certain aspects, which is fine, it increases the nuance and discoverability of prior scenes. Rewarding viewers for paying attention and not giving them a jigsaw puzzle that's too easy to complete. And the thing that especially makes this worse is that it's revealed almost halfway through the season. This should have been a twist in the beginning, and apparently, the creators considered this in an interview with Rolling Stone, but ultimately decided to reveal it in episode 4. It's also crazy that Mark can't even pick up on the behavioral changes of Helly. This is the other problem I have, and I think it's a massive oversight that Mark was fooled so easily. He spends every waking moment with Helly, so any minor changes should be immediately noticeable. Humans have a great understanding for interpreting the nuances of expressions. Imagine your significant other or best friend completely changing the way they act. You'll know something is wrong, and that's why I think the writers are underestimating Mark here. Or, I don't know, maybe it would be more believable if Helena tried harder to act like Helly, and that made Mark's suspicions dissipate. You can argue that severed workers don't have enough social experience to be adept at this, but that kind of opens this can of worms in that if you're severed and have no memories of anything, then without any education and development, wouldn't you mentally be a toddler? This is obviously going off topic, and I want to highlight a great twist already within Severance to punctuate what makes a twist effective, which is Helly being an Egan. There's no overt information throughout Season 1 that would immediately lead you to this conclusion. There are clues that allude to this, but these clues make you theorize what Helly's outie is like. It sparks mystery and makes you ask questions. How can someone be this evil and disrespectful? Are they rich or coming from an executive position given those traits? But then, why would they be severing themselves and working a manual job? This allows you to theorize potential outcomes without getting a bunch of information that points to one specific conclusion. So when the initial twist comes, it's surprising, it completely recontextualizes everything that comes before, and it makes sense. So this is essentially why I'm not a big fan of episode 4, where by this point in the season, I'm just waiting for them to reveal this twist. On top of Milchek's plan being really odd despite him having an arc that insinuates him having a higher level of intelligence than what he's displaying in what are obvious follies.
And eradicating from your essence childish folly.
I know vocabulary isn't the same as intellect, but his arc correlates with anti-intellectualism and him going against that. He is trying to be kind in the beginning, although there are more convenient avenues to express that than doing an extravagant outdoor outing. Everything that I've brought up so far leads to a point of, it feels like season 2 is offset by a few episodes. Every plot point should be coming sooner than it does. Everything feels delayed by either artificial moments in the writing, multiple subplots that distract from the main story, or directions the writers take the narrative that don't make sense, that inherently burn a lot of time, along with some major points in the story that don't end up being as impactful for how much time we spent on it. I recognize that the placement of Season 2's ending needs to be where it is for important reasons, but I don't think the writers built a cohesive and consistent narrative with active momentum throughout its entirety. I know I've been railing into the show and airing out some grievances I have, and I'm only doing this because I feel Severance is so close to perfection. This is such a unique show, and its surreal and absurd nature is spectacular. I actually kind of came around on the ending partially because it genuinely had some great moments. In particular, Mark accidentally killing Drummond was absolute perfection. Gwendolyn Christie basically gets a homage fight to her scene in Game of Thrones against the Hound. The whole stand-up and band routine was iconic and further leans into the show's fun absurdity, and there are some strong dialogue scenes. Even the reveal of the mystery of Cold Harbor and what they've been doing is pretty satisfying, which is a hard thing to do given how hyped up this point has been throughout the season. Lumen essentially trying to create the perfect severed employee who operates as a mindless slave is perfect and is completely in line with what this kind of corporation would want. And that person being Gemma and Mark needing to get her out in this heist-like finale is an outstanding ending. It's just too bad it takes a while to get here, and the road was very bumpy. Then despite the ending being good, there are still some questions and odd moments that happen. Like Mark coincidentally trying to open this door right next to the secret ritual door. The door that Gemma tries to open is for some reason locked, even though this door wasn't in season 1, which the entire season finale hinges on this door being locked. I guess there's also no security in the entirety of Lumen who would realistically apprehend Gemma when she tries to exit the staircase. Then finally, Helly encouraging Mark to come with her seems out of character since she was supporting Mark to be with his wife earlier. You can argue that the Glasgow block was lifted and this is Helena, but I guess we'll have to see for season 3, and it'll be kind of odd if they do that twist again. Which, for season 3, a major point for this ending is that it seems to be setting up this rebellion/union arc for the Innies. But couldn't Lumen just turn on the Glasgow block for everyone and eliminate this? Does it only apply to Helly, and if it does, then why doesn't it apply to everyone? Or just turn off the Severance machine or whatever. It seems like the writers are going to have to come up with a bunch of different arbitrary mechanics for the story to even function moving forward. All in all, I still think Severance is a good show, and is definitely much better than most TV shows currently airing, and I'm not in the "this is the best show ever" mindset. It's especially extremely well made, and even though I think the plot drags, is muddled, and can be distracted at times, the concepts the writers explore are still thought-provoking and interesting. You can tell the creatives are passionate about this premise, and are genuinely curious about exploring the general concepts in intriguing directions. I respect Severance, and hopefully this was an interesting and nuanced viewpoint into a show that's universally beloved. Thank you for watching, and let me know in the comments what you thought about Severance and if you have any critiques. My Letterboxd, Discord, and Patreon links are in the description, and have a great day. Thank you so much to my top patrons Logan Farmer and Simply Put.